The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds as Dr. James Coleman walked through the busy airport terminal. He had just finished 3 intense days at a medical conference in Chicago, learning about the latest techniques in heart surgery. His presentation on saving children with heart problems had been well received, and he was looking forward to getting home to his family. James was tired from the long conference days, so he had decided to dress comfortably for the flight. He wore his favorite jeans, a soft gray hoodie, and comfortable sneakers. His old leather medical bag hung over his shoulder, the same bag his father had given him when he graduated from medical school 15 years ago. To anyone looking, he appeared to be just another casual traveler heading home. As he approached his gate, James pulled out his phone to check his boarding pass one more time. First class, seat 2A. He had used his frequent flyer miles to upgrade, because he wanted to rest properly before his surgery scheduled for the next morning. A young boy needed a complex heart operation, and James wanted to be at his absolute best. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and James joined the first-class line. He noticed how other passengers were dressed: business suits, expensive jewelry, designer handbags. But James had learned long ago that clothes don't make the person. Some of his best colleagues wore simple scrubs to work every day, and some of his most grateful patients had been people who couldn't afford fancy clothes. When James reached the gate, he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent with a friendly smile. The young man scanned it quickly and welcomed him aboard with genuine warmth. James felt good about the flight ahead as he walked down the jet bridge toward the plane. The aircraft was a large Boeing 777, and James found his way to the first-class cabin. The seats looked comfortable with plenty of legroom, exactly what he needed after 3 days of standing presentations and long meetings. He located seat 2A by the window and began to settle in, placing his medical bag in the overhead compartment, above his seat. That's when he first noticed her watching him. Lisa Thompson had been working as a flight attendant for 8 years. She took pride in maintaining what she called proper standards in the first-class cabin. As James approached his seat, she observed him with a critical eye. His casual clothes immediately caught her attention. In her mind, first-class passengers should look a certain way, and this man didn't fit her expectations. Lisa approached James as he was adjusting his seatbelt. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a tone that wasn't quite polite. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" James looked up, slightly surprised but not concerned. He had encountered this before in hotels and restaurants. He calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, handing it to her with a patient smile. Lisa examined the boarding pass carefully, turning it over as if looking for signs of forgery. "This shows seat 2A, she said slowly, "but I need to verify this is actually your seat." "I understand," James replied calmly. "That's definitely my seat. I upgraded using my miles yesterday." But Lisa wasn't satisfied. "Do you have another form of identification? Something that shows this ticket actually belongs to you?" Other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction. A businessman across the aisle looked over his newspaper. An older woman in the seat behind James craned her neck to see what was happening. The atmosphere in the cabin was becoming tense. James maintained his composure, though he felt the familiar weight of being judged by his appearance. "Of course," he said, reaching for his wallet. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to Lisa. She studied both documents, comparing them multiple times. "Dr. James Coleman," she read aloud, emphasizing the word doctor with obvious skepticism in her voice. "That's correct," James confirmed. "I'm a cardiac surgeon at Metropolitan Hospital." Lisa's expression suggested she didn't believe him. "A doctor," she repeated, looking pointedly at his casual clothes. "And you're traveling in first class?" "Yes, I am," James said simply. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him now, and he was acutely aware that this conversation was becoming a spectacle. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this with the gate agent," Lisa announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. James felt his patience being tested, but he knew getting upset would only make things worse. "I'd be happy to step aside, but I assure you everything is in order." I've shown you my boarding pass and my identification. Lisa was already reaching for her phone. Gate agent, this is Lisa in first class. I have a passenger here claiming to have seat 2A, but I need verification. She paused, listening to the response. Yes, I'll hold. The minutes ticked by slowly. James stood in the aisle, acutely aware that every passenger in first class was watching this unfold. Some looked uncomfortable with the situation, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama. He thought about the young patient waiting for surgery tomorrow and hoped this delay wouldn't affect his schedule. Finally, Lisa ended her call, but instead of apologizing, she seemed even more determined. Sir, I'm still not comfortable with this situation. You're going to need to return to the gate for additional verification. Ma'am, James said, his voice still calm but firmer now. I've provided you with my boarding pass and identification. The gate agent has confirmed my seat. What additional verification do you need? Lisa's voice grew louder. Sir, I need you to cooperate with me. You're creating a disturbance in my cabin. James looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. I'm not creating any disturbance. I'm simply trying to take my assigned seat. You're being argumentative and disruptive, Lisa declared, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. I'm going to have to call security. The word security sent a ripple through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to watch were now openly staring. James felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from the injustice of the situation. There's no need for security, James said carefully. I'm happy to cooperate, but I've done everything you've asked. But Lisa had already made up her mind. She walked to the front of the plane and picked up the phone to call security. James could hear her speaking in urgent, hushed tones, describing what she called a difficult passenger situation in first class. As James waited, he thought about his father, who had faced similar situations during the civil rights era. His father had always taught him to maintain his dignity no matter how others behaved. He thought about his patients who trusted him with their lives, and his colleagues who respected his skills and character. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance to the first-class cabin. They were both professional in appearance, but James could see they had already been given Lisa's version of events. Sir, the first officer said, we need you to come with us. James gathered his belongings slowly, his medical bag feeling heavier than usual as he pulled it from the overhead compartment. As he walked toward the front of the plane, he could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every assumption being made about him. The walk down the jet bridge felt like the longest walk of his life, but James kept his head high, knowing that his character would speak louder than this moment of injustice. The airport security office was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Dr. James Coleman sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his medical bag at his feet, while the 2 security officers spoke with Lisa Thompson in hushed tones near the door. He could hear fragments of their conversation, words like disruptive, argumentative, and refuse to cooperate, floating through the air like accusations. James checked his watch. The flight was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes, and he had a surgery scheduled for 7 in the morning. His patient, a 12-year-old boy named Tommy, was counting on him. The child's parents had waited months for this operation, and James had spent weeks preparing for the complex procedure. Officer Martinez, the taller of the 2 security guards, approached James with a clipboard. Dr. Coleman, we need to go through some standard questions with you. I understand, James replied calmly. But I want you to know that I haven't done anything wrong. I simply tried to take my assigned seat. Martinez nodded, but James could see he had already made up his mind based on Lisa's report. The flight attendant says you were being difficult and wouldn't follow instructions. That's not accurate, James said firmly but respectfully. I showed her my boarding pass and identification. I answered all her questions. I never raised my voice or refused to cooperate. The second officer, Williams, looked up from his notes. She says you were argumentative when she asked for additional verification. James felt frustration building in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. I asked what additional verification she needed after I had already provided everything. She requested That's not being argumentative, that's asking a reasonable question. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the other first-class passengers were watching the drama unfold with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Robert Chen, a businessman in seat 3B, had witnessed the entire interaction. He turned to his wife and whispered, "That man didn't do anything wrong. He was completely polite the whole time." His wife, Patricia, nodded in agreement. "I don't understand why she was giving him such a hard time. He had his boarding pass and everything." Across the aisle, Margaret Foster, a retired school principal, was becoming increasingly upset by what she had witnessed. She had taught for 35 years and had seen this kind of unfair treatment before. She stood up and approached Lisa, who was now checking other passengers' seat assignments with exaggerated thoroughness. "Excuse me," Margaret said firmly. "I think you should know that I watched that entire interaction, and that gentleman did absolutely nothing wrong." Lisa barely looked up from her checklist. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a security matter that I handled appropriately." "He was completely polite and cooperative," Margaret insisted. "He showed you his documents, answered your questions, and never raised his voice." "What you did was wrong." Lisa's face flushed red. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. I don't need passengers telling me how to do my job." Margaret reluctantly sat down, but she was already pulling out her phone. She had recorded part of the interaction, and she knew this wasn't right. Back in the security office, James was trying to explain the situation to the officers, but he could see they weren't really listening. Their minds were made up, and they were just going through the motions of an investigation. "Look," Officer Martinez said, "we can resolve this easily. There's another flight to Atlanta in 3 hours. We can get you rebooked, and everyone goes home happy." "But I have a surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning," James explained. "A child is depending on me. I can't miss this flight." Williams shrugged. "Should have thought about that before causing problems on the plane." James felt his heart sink. These men had already decided he was guilty, and nothing he said was going to change their minds. He thought about fighting it, demanding to speak with a supervisor, but he knew that would only delay things further and potentially make him miss even more flights. "Fine," he said quietly. "Rebook me on the next flight." As James was being processed, for the later flight, Lisa returned to the plane with a satisfied expression. She announced to her colleague, David, who worked in the economy section, "Well, that problem is solved. Some people just don't understand that there are standards to maintain." David looked confused. "What happened?" "I saw security escort someone off. Passenger in first class who didn't belong there," Lisa said dismissively. "Tried to use a seat that wasn't his, then got argumentative when I questioned him about it." David frowned. "But didn't he have a boarding pass?" Lisa waved her hand. "Anyone can get a boarding pass. Doesn't mean they actually belong in first class. You have to look at the whole picture. How they're dressed, how they act, whether they fit in." David felt uncomfortable with Lisa's explanation, but he didn't push the issue. He had worked with Lisa for 2 years and had noticed her tendency to be particularly strict with certain passengers, but he had never said anything about it. The plane was finally ready for departure, running 15 minutes behind schedule due to the delay. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Margaret Foster was on her phone with the airline's customer service line. "I want to file a complaint about the treatment of a passenger on Flight 447, she said firmly. "What I witnessed was completely unacceptable." The customer service representative took down the details, but Margaret could tell from her tone that this was just another complaint that would likely be filed away and forgotten. Robert Chen was also on his phone, but he was posting on social media. He had managed to record part of the incident, and he felt compelled to share what he had witnessed. "Just saw a doctor get kicked off our flight for literally no reason," he typed. "This is 2024, and this kind of discrimination is still happening." As the plane climbed to cruising altitude, Lisa felt vindicated in her actions. In her mind, she had maintained the proper standards for first class and handled a difficult situation professionally. She had no idea that her actions had been recorded by multiple passengers, or that her decision would soon have consequences she never imagined. Dr. James Coleman sat in the airport terminal, waiting for his rescheduled flight. He had called the hospital to explain the delay and had spoken with Tommy's parents to reassure them that he would still be there for the surgery, just a few hours later than planned. As he waited, James reflected on what had just happened. He had faced discrimination before, but it never got easier. Each incident was a reminder that no matter how much he achieved, no matter how many lives he saved, some people would always see him as someone who didn't belong. He pulled out his phone and saw several missed calls from his wife. When he called her back, she could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "What happened?" she asked gently. "The usual," James said with a sigh. "Someone decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class." His wife was quiet for a moment. After 15 years of marriage, she knew exactly what that meant. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," James said, though they both knew he wasn't. "I'll be home tonight, just a few hours late." As James ended the call, he had no idea that in just a few hours his ordeal would be vindicated in a way he never could have imagined. The flight he had been forced to leave was about to face a crisis that would change everything. Flight 447 had been in the air for exactly 7 minutes when everything changed. The seatbelt sign had just turned off, and passengers were beginning to settle in for what they expected to be a routine 2-hour flight to Atlanta. Lisa Thompson was in the galley, preparing the first-class beverage service, still feeling satisfied about how she had handled the earlier situation. In seat 4C, 68-year-old Helen Rodriguez was looking through photos on her phone. She was traveling to Atlanta to see her newest grandchild for the first time. Her daughter had just given birth to a beautiful baby girl, and Helen couldn't wait to hold her. She had been planning this trip for weeks, carefully packing gifts and preparing to help her daughter during those precious first days with a newborn. Helen had been feeling a bit tired lately, but she attributed it to the excitement of becoming a grandmother again. She had raised 4 children of her own and helped with 7 other grandchildren. At 68, she was still active and healthy, or so she thought. As she scrolled through the baby photos her daughter had sent, Helen suddenly felt a sharp, crushing pain in her chest. It started as a tight sensation, like someone was squeezing her heart with an iron fist. She gasped and dropped her phone, her hand instinctively moving to her chest. "Oh no," she whispered, recognizing the symptoms immediately. Her husband had suffered a heart attack 3 years earlier, and the doctor had explained all the warning signs to both of them. The pain intensified quickly, radiating down her left arm and up into her jaw. Helen tried to press the call button, but her vision was becoming blurry. The crushing sensation in her chest was getting worse by the second, and she could feel cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. Robert Chen, sitting across the aisle, noticed Helen's distress first. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, leaning toward her. Helen tried to respond, but she couldn't catch her breath. The words came out in a weak whisper. "Heart attack." Robert immediately pressed his call button and stood up. "We need help over here," he called out loudly enough for the flight attendants to hear. Lisa emerged from the galley looking annoyed at the commotion. "Sir, please keep your voice down. What seems to be the problem?" "This lady is having a heart attack," Robert said urgently, pointing to Helen, who was now clutching her chest and struggling to breathe. Lisa's expression changed immediately as she saw Helen's condition. The older woman's face had turned pale gray, and she was clearly in severe distress. Lisa had received basic first aid training, but nothing had prepared her for a real medical emergency like this. "Oh my God," Lisa gasped, rushing to Helen's side. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Helen nodded weakly, but she couldn't speak. The pain was overwhelming, and she felt like an elephant was sitting on her chest. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Lisa's hands were shaking as she reached for the emergency medical kit. She had practiced these scenarios in training, but this was real life, and a woman's life was hanging in the balance. "I need to make an announcement," Lisa said, her voice trembling. She grabbed the intercom microphone with shaking hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. If there is a doctor or medical professional on this flight, please press your call button immediately and identify yourself to a flight attendant." The announcement echoed through the cabin, and passengers began looking around anxiously. In first class, business class, and economy. People waited for someone to respond, but the seconds ticked by and no call buttons lit up. Margaret Foster, who had witnessed the earlier incident with Dr. Coleman, felt her heart sink. She knew exactly who should have been on this plane to help. Lisa tried again, her voice more desperate this time. "This is an urgent medical emergency. We need a doctor or nurse on board immediately. Please identify yourself to any flight attendant." Again, silence. No medical professionals were on the flight. Helen's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her lips were starting to turn blue, a sign that her heart wasn't pumping blood effectively. Her breathing became more labored, and she was making soft moaning sounds with each exhale. David, the economy flight attendant, rushed forward with the automated external defibrillator. "I've got the AED," he said, setting it down beside Helen's seat. Lisa opened the medical kit with trembling fingers. Inside were basic supplies: aspirin, oxygen, blood pressure cuff, and some other emergency medications. But she wasn't trained to handle a severe heart attack, and she knew it. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you some aspirin," Lisa said, trying to keep her voice calm for Helen's sake. "Can you chew this for me?" Helen tried to take the aspirin, but she was having trouble swallowing. The crushing pain in her chest was getting worse, and she felt like she was drowning from the inside. Robert Chen had pulled out his phone and was recording the emergency, not for social media, but as potential evidence of what was happening. He couldn't stop thinking about the doctor who had been removed from the flight just minutes before takeoff. "This is insane," he muttered to his wife. "There was a cardiac surgeon on this plane. A cardiac surgeon, and they kicked him off." Margaret Foster heard him and felt sick to her stomach. She approached Lisa, who was frantically trying to figure out what to do next. "The man you had removed from this flight," Margaret said urgently. "He was a heart doctor, a cardiac surgeon." Lisa looked up from Helen, her face going even paler. "What?" "The passenger you had security remove," Margaret repeated, her voice filled with accusation. "He was a cardiac surgeon. He could have saved her life." The realization hit Lisa like a physical blow. The man she had dismissed as not belonging in first class, the man she had accused of being disruptive, was exactly the person they desperately needed right now. "No," Lisa whispered, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. "No, no, no." Helen's breathing became even more shallow, and her eyes were starting to flutter closed. The oxygen mask Lisa had placed over her face wasn't helping enough. This was beyond basic first aid. This was a major cardiac event that required immediate medical intervention. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please update me on the medical situation immediately. Lisa." Grabbed the phone to the cockpit, her voice breaking. "Captain, we have a passenger in cardiac arrest. No medical professionals on board. We need to land immediately." "Roger. We're declaring a medical emergency and requesting immediate clearance to the nearest airport," the captain responded. "ETA to landing is 12 minutes. 12 minutes felt like an eternity. Helen was fighting for her life, and everyone in first class could see she was losing the battle. Her skin had turned an alarming shade of gray, and her pulse was becoming weaker and more irregular. Lisa knelt beside Helen, holding her hand. "Stay with us, ma'am. We're getting you help. Just hang on." But deep in her heart, Lisa knew the truth. The help Helen needed had been on this plane just minutes ago. The qualified medical professional who could have made the difference was sitting in an airport terminal because of Lisa's prejudice and poor judgment. David was monitoring Helen's vital signs as best he could with the basic equipment available. "Her pulse is very weak," he reported quietly to Lisa. "Blood pressure is dropping." Other passengers in first class were praying, some quietly, others more openly. The entire cabin had fallen silent except for the sounds of Helen's labored breathing and the hum of the aircraft engines. Margaret Foster couldn't stay silent any longer. She looked directly at Lisa and said what everyone was thinking. "That doctor you kicked off this plane could have saved her. This is on you." Lisa felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she tried to focus on helping Helen. However, she knew Margaret was right. Her actions had directly contributed to this crisis, and a woman's life hung in the balance because of her prejudice and stubbornness. The emergency landing at Nashville International Airport was unlike anything the passengers of Flight 447 had ever experienced. Captain Rodriguez brought the plane down with precision, while emergency vehicles raced across the tarmac with their lights flashing and sirens wailing. The moment the aircraft came to a stop, paramedics rushed aboard. Helen Rodriguez was unconscious by the time the medical team reached her. Her pulse was barely detectable, and her breathing had become dangerously shallow. The lead paramedic, a veteran named Mike Turner, immediately began working to stabilize her while his team prepared to move her to the ambulance. "How long has she been in cardiac arrest?" Mike asked Lisa, who was standing nearby with tears streaming down her face. "About 15 minutes, Lisa replied, her voice barely a whisper. "We tried everything we could, but we didn't have a doctor on board." Mike nodded grimly as he worked. 15 minutes was a critical amount of time for a heart attack patient. Every minute that passed without proper medical intervention decreased Helen's chances of survival significantly. As the paramedics carefully moved Helen onto a stretcher, Margaret Foster approached Mike Turner. She was a woman who had spent her life standing up for what was right, and she couldn't stay silent now. "Sir," she said firmly, "I think you should know something important. There was a cardiac surgeon on this flight who was removed before takeoff." Mike looked up from his equipment, surprised. "A cardiac surgeon? What happened to him?" Margaret glanced meaningfully at Lisa, who had gone pale. "He was kicked off the plane by the flight attendant. She claimed he was being disruptive, but he wasn't. He was completely polite and cooperative." Mike's expression grew serious. In his 20 years as a paramedic, he had seen how crucial those first few minutes were in cardiac emergencies. Having a cardiac surgeon on board could have been the difference between life and death. "Is this true?" Mike asked Lisa directly. Lisa couldn't meet his eyes. She nodded slowly, the full weight of her actions crushing down on her. "Yes, it's true." Meanwhile, Robert Chen had been busy on his phone during the emergency landing. He had uploaded his video of the earlier incident to social media, along with a detailed explanation of what had happened. His post was already being shared rapidly across multiple platforms. "Unbelievable discrimination on Flight 447, he had written. "They kicked off a black cardiac surgeon for no reason, and now, someone is having a heart attack on our plane. The doctor who could have saved her life was removed because of prejudice. This is absolutely outrageous." The post was gaining traction quickly. People were commenting, sharing, and expressing their outrage at what had happened. Several passengers from the flight were also posting their own accounts of the events, each one confirming that Dr. Coleman had done nothing wrong. Captain Rodriguez came back to check on the situation and to speak with the passengers. He was a seasoned pilot who had dealt with many emergencies, but this situation was particularly troubling when he learned the full story. "Let me understand this correctly," he said to Lisa after hearing Margaret's account. "We had a qualified cardiac surgeon on board, and he was removed before takeoff." Lisa nodded miserably. I thought he didn't belong in first class. He was dressed casually, and I questioned his boarding pass." Captain Rodriguez felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice controlled. "You removed a paying passenger, a medical doctor, based on how he was dressed?" "I was trying to maintain standards," Lisa said weakly, knowing how foolish it sounded now. "Standards?" Captain Rodriguez repeated. "Ma'am, your standards may have cost a woman her life." The news of the incident was spreading beyond social media. Robert Chen's video had been picked up by a local news blogger, who immediately recognized the significance of the story. Within an hour of the emergency landing, major news outlets were picking up the story. At Nashville International Airport, Helen was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where the cardiac surgery team was standing by. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lead cardiac surgeon, met the ambulance at the emergency entrance. "What's her status?" Dr. Williams asked as they wheeled Helen into the trauma bay. 68-year-old female, massive myocardial infarction, downtime approximately 20 minutes, Mike Turner reported. "She's been in and out of consciousness. Vitals are unstable." Dr. Williams immediately began assessing Helen's condition. The delay in receiving proper medical care had made her situation much more critical than it needed to be. Every minute without intervention had allowed more heart muscle to die. Back on the plane, airline officials had arrived to investigate the incident. Regional Manager Kevin Thompson was conducting interviews with passengers and crew members. What he was learning made him increasingly uncomfortable. "So let me get this straight," Kevin said to Lisa in the galley. "Dr. Coleman showed you his boarding pass, his identification, and you verified his seat assignment with the gate agent, but you still had him removed from the aircraft?" Lisa tried to explain her reasoning, but it sounded worse each time she said it. "He just didn't seem like he belonged in first class. His clothes, his attitude." "His attitude?" Kevin interrupted. "Multiple passengers have told me he was completely polite and cooperative. What exactly was wrong with his attitude?" Lisa couldn't answer. She knew now that her actions had been based on prejudice, not any legitimate security concern. Meanwhile, Margaret Foster was speaking with a reporter who had arrived at the airport. As a retired educator, she knew the importance of speaking truth to power, and she wasn't going to let this incident be covered up. "That young man did absolutely nothing wrong," she told the reporter firmly. "He was polite, he had all his proper documentation, and he cooperated with every request." But the flight attendant kept pushing and pushing until she found an excuse to have him removed. It was clear discrimination, and now look what happened. The reporter was taking detailed notes. This was exactly the kind of story that exposed systemic problems in the airline industry, and he knew it would resonate with people across the country. At the hospital, Dr. Williams was working frantically to save Helen's life. The heart attack had been massive, and the delay in treatment had complicated everything. Helen's chances of survival were dropping with each passing minute. "We need to get her to surgery immediately," Dr. Williams told her team. "This should have been treated 20 minutes ago. We're fighting against time now." Back at the airport, Dr. James Coleman was still waiting for his rescheduled flight when his phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends and colleagues were sending him links to the social media posts about Flight 447. At first, he didn't understand what they were talking about. Then he saw Robert Chen's video and read the accompanying story. His heart sank as he realized what had happened. Someone on his original flight had suffered a heart attack, and he could have been there to help. James immediately called the airline's customer service line. "This is Dr. James Coleman. I was removed from Flight 447 this morning, and I understand. There was a medical emergency on that flight. I want to know if I can help in any way." The customer service representative was flustered. The story was already making national news, and the airline was scrambling to manage the crisis. "Dr. Coleman, let me transfer you to our regional manager immediately." Within minutes, James was speaking with Kevin Thompson, who was still at the Nashville airport. "Dr. Coleman, I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning. We are conducting a full investigation." "I appreciate that," James said. "But right now I'm more concerned about the passenger who had the heart attack. Is there anything I can do to help? I can catch the next flight to Nashville if needed." Kevin was struck by James's immediate concern for the patient, despite how he had been treated. "The passenger is at Vanderbilt Medical Center. I'll make sure you can speak with the cardiac team there if you'd like." The story was now trending on multiple social media platforms. Honor Flight 447 and Not Justice for Dr. Coleman were gaining momentum as people shared their outrage about the incident. Videos of the original confrontation recorded by passengers were being viewed millions of times. Lisa Thompson sat in the airport security office, watching her career and reputation crumble in real time. She had received dozens of missed calls from friends and family who had seen the news coverage. Her supervisor had already informed her that she was suspended pending a full investigation. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in. Her prejudice and poor judgment hadn't just ruined her career. They had potentially cost an innocent woman her life, and there was no way to undo any of it. The news broke on every major network within hours. "Airline discrimination leads to life-threatening crisis," dominated headlines across the country. The story of Dr. James Coleman and Helen Rodriguez had touched a nerve with millions of people who recognized the deeper issues at play. At Vanderbilt University Medical Center, Dr. Patricia Williams emerged from surgery after 6 grueling hours. Helen's family had gathered in the waiting room, her daughter Maria, son-in-law Carlos, and her other 3 children who had flown in from different states. The anxiety in their faces was heartbreaking. "The surgery went as well as we could hope," Dr. Williams told the family, her scrubs still damp with sweat. "Your mother is stable, but I won't lie to you. The delay in treatment caused significant damage to her heart. The next 24 hours will be critical." Maria Rodriguez broke down in tears. If that doctor had been on the plane, if they hadn't kicked him off. Dr. Williams nodded grimly. A cardiac surgeon on scene during those first few minutes could have made all the difference. The damage we're seeing now was largely preventable. The family's pain was made worse by knowing that their mother's condition was the result of someone else's prejudice and poor judgment. Meanwhile, the airline's corporate headquarters in Atlanta was in full crisis mode. CEO William Patterson had called an emergency board meeting after watching the story explode across social media and news networks. The company's stock price had already dropped 3% in after-hours trading. "How did this happen?" Patterson demanded, looking around the conference table at his senior executives. "How did we allow a paying customer, a doctor, to be removed from a flight for no legitimate reason?" Regional Manager Kevin Thompson, who had flown back from Nashville, delivered his preliminary report. "Sir, based on my investigation, the passenger Dr. Coleman did absolutely nothing wrong. Multiple witnesses confirm he was polite and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. Flight attendant Lisa Thompson appears to have acted based on personal bias rather than any legitimate security concern." Patterson felt his stomach drop. In 30 years in the airline industry, he had seen discrimination cases before, but never one with such clear-cut evidence and such devastating consequences. "What's our legal exposure?" he asked the company's chief counsel. "Significant," came the reply. "We're looking at potential discrimination lawsuits from Dr. Coleman, possible wrongful death claims if Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't survive, and massive public relations damage. This could cost us tens of millions in settlements and lost business." The decision was swift and decisive. "Lisa Thompson is terminated immediately," Patterson announced. "Full severance forfeited. We'll cooperate fully with any investigations. And I want a comprehensive review of all our discrimination policies." Back in Nashville, Dr. Coleman had caught the first available flight after speaking with the airline executives. He arrived at Vanderbilt Medical Center not as a patient advocate or legal representative, but simply as one doctor wanting to help another doctor save a patient's life. Dr. Williams met him in the cardiac unit. "Dr. Coleman, I've heard about what happened. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." James shook his head. "Right now, I'm just concerned about Mrs. Rodriguez. How can I help?" The 2 doctors spent the next hour reviewing Helen's case. James provided insights that could help with her recovery plan, and his expertise proved valuable even though the immediate crisis had passed. When Helen's family learned that Dr. Coleman was at the hospital, they insisted on meeting him. The encounter in the family waiting room was emotional and powerful. "Dr. Coleman," Maria said through her tears, "I'm so sorry for what they did to you. And I'm sorry my mother is suffering because of their ignorance." James took her hands gently. "Your mother is a fighter. Dr. Williams is one of the best cardiac surgeons in the country. We're going to take good care of her." The family was struck by his grace and compassion despite everything he had endured. Here was a man who had been humiliated and discriminated against, yet his first concern was for their mother's well-being. Over the next 3 days, the story continued to dominate national news. Lisa Thompson found herself at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters camped outside her apartment, and her phone rang constantly with interview requests. She had hired a lawyer and been advised not to speak publicly, but the pressure was overwhelming. The airline industry as a whole was being forced to confront its discrimination problems. Other passengers began coming forward with their own stories of unfair treatment, and civil rights organizations called for comprehensive reforms. Dr. Coleman used the attention to shine a light on broader issues. In a carefully crafted statement, released through his lawyer, he said, What happened to me happens to people of color every day in airports, hotels, restaurants, and other public spaces. We shouldn't need a medical emergency to recognize that discrimination is wrong and harmful to everyone. His dignified response earned him even more respect and support. Medical colleagues across the country reached out to offer their solidarity, and speaking invitations poured in from hospitals and medical schools. On the fourth day, Helen Rodriguez opened her eyes for the first time since her surgery. Her daughter Maria was holding her hand when she regained consciousness. "Mama," Maria whispered, "you're going to be okay." Helen's recovery would be long and difficult. The damage to her heart was permanent, and she would need extensive rehabilitation. But she was alive, and her doctors were optimistic about her long-term prognosis. When Helen learned the full story of what had happened, she insisted on meeting Dr. Coleman. The meeting took place in her hospital room with her family present. "Dr. Dew Coleman," she said in a weak but determined voice, "thank you for coming here to help with my care. I'm sorry you were treated so badly." James smiled warmly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you just focus on getting better. That's all that matters now." But Helen wasn't finished. "I want you to know that my family and I are going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. What they did to you was wrong, and we're going to help fight it." True to her word, the Rodriguez family became vocal advocates for airline discrimination reform. They filed a civil lawsuit not just for damages, but to force policy changes across the industry. Dr. Coleman also filed suit, but he announced that any settlement money would go toward establishing a scholarship fund for underrepresented minorities in medical school. "The best way to honor what happened is to ensure more people like me have the opportunity to become doctors," he said. The airline settled both lawsuits within 6 months. The terms were confidential, but the money funded scholarships for dozens of medical students and led to comprehensive changes in airline policies nationwide. Lisa Thompson's termination became a cautionary tale throughout the industry. She struggled to find work in aviation after the incident, and eventually left the field entirely. In rare public comments, she expressed regret for her actions, but the damage to her reputation was permanent. The incident led to mandatory bias, training for all airline employees, clearer policies for handling passenger disputes, and better oversight of staff decision-making. Multiple airlines revised their training programs to prevent similar incidents. Dr. Coleman returned to his practice and became a sought-after speaker on issues of discrimination and bias. He used his platform to advocate for fair treatment of all people and to encourage others to speak up when they witnessed injustice. Helen Rodriguez made a remarkable recovery, though she would always live with the effects of her heart attack. She became a powerful voice for change, speaking at airline industry conferences and working with civil rights organizations. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher who had spoken up during the original incident, became a close friend of both families. Her courage in documenting and reporting what she witnessed had been crucial in bringing the truth to light. The story of Flight 447 became a turning point in how the airline industry addressed discrimination. It showed that prejudice and bias don't just hurt individuals, they can have life and death consequences for everyone. Most importantly, it demonstrated that ordinary people have the power to stand up for what's right and create lasting change. Through tragedy came transformation, and through injustice came a renewed commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect.